Welcome to the Kingsburg Community Church podcast, Thinking About Faith. We pray that this podcast helps you deepen your faith in God and stir some inner thoughts about the Christian life.
Hi, everyone. It's Pastor Ed. Welcome to the KCC podcast, Thinking About Faith. Today, we're in part 2 of what I'm calling the Return of the God Hypothesis. I actually stole that title from a book by Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's the president of the Discovery Institute. He's a PhD scientist from the University of Cambridge, and he wrote a book talking about the 3 great discoveries of the 20th century that by the scientific discoveries that have actually made belief in God more hospitable than it was 100 years ago. Let me ask you a question. If you find a key on the ground outside and you walk around a building trying it on the locks that are nearby, and you find that one lock opens when you turn the key, don't you assume that the key was made for that specific lock? It's not a trick question. It's obvious, right? Keys and locks are the sort of things that are made specifically for each other. One is worthless without the other. If you've ever had a lock and you lost the key, it was not a happy moment. Or if you had a key, most of us have key drawers, and you forgot what lock it goes to. Very, very frustrating, because you're just going to have to go out and buy a new lock when, in fact, probably somewhere there's an old lock that would do just well, but you can't find it. The lock and the key go together. Today, we're going to talk about a scientific discovery in the last 100 years that has been very hospitable to the idea that just as a key is designed for a specific lock, the universe that we live in, this earth that we love and find beautiful, was designed for a specific purpose. And that there are hints in the physical universe to the fact that we live in a universe that was designed specifically to be hospitable for life, for our lives, and for the universe as we find it. This theory, or this series of discoveries over the last 100 years, can be called the finely tuned universe. Finely tuned. The whole idea that the universe is like a piano, that every note has to be tuned. I believe there are 3 strings to every note on the piano. Is that true, Kevin? Kevin's across from me, and he just nodded his head. So it's, if one of the 3 strings is out of tune, you have a piano that's out of tune. And one of the things that we've discovered over the years at KCC is, in our sanctuary, the difference between the heat in the sanctuary during the summer and the cold in our sanctuary during the winter makes the strings stretch. And so somebody with a very sensitive ear like Kevin's can tell that the piano is not great, not happy. And so before a recital, if it's during the summer, he has to go in and turn on the air conditioner way beforehand, because the heat will mess up the tuning. And each, if you take whatever 88 keys on a piano keyboard and multiply times 3, that's, close to 300, maybe more than 300 strings that you have to tune. That's a lot of tuning. And so I think that the tuners, when they come in, they try to tune it toward an average temperature, because it's always going to go in and out, and we have to continually have it retuned, because that's what pianos do. The idea is that the universe that we inhabit has properties that are just perfect in order to create the universe that we have, for things to work the way they do. I'm sure you've seen pictures of back 50 years ago when we had American astronauts on the moon, and you saw one of the astronauts pull out a golf ball and a golf club, and because he wanted to hit drive that would go farther than any drive could hit, any ball could go on Earth, because of course the moon has much lower gravity. I think it has 1/6 of the gravity of Earth, and so that golf ball, probably went, I don't know, a quarter mile or something like that, because there's just isn't as much gravity there. Isn't it good that we have 6 times the gravity of the moon, because it helps us do things that we have to do in everyday life? It's nice when the water of the waterfall actually flows at the right flow rate. It's nice when you can catch a baseball because it doesn't go out of the stadium, because the gravitational pull of the Earth is fairly constant. We live in a universe that is remarkably stable, even though last week I talked about the fact the universe is expanding, and it is, but the universe is remarkably stable. That is, it's expanding at a fairly constant rate, slowing just a bit, but it's expanding fairly constantly. And because if you could imagine, I said the universe is expanding like a balloon. Well, what happens if you pop the balloon? It collapses, right? If one of the constants of the universe was just a little bit different, after the Big Bang, everything would have collapsed in on each other because of the gravity of all the matter of the universe. So that the outward force of the Big Bang had to be just right to keep the universe expanding at the rate it has expanded now, but not too fast. If it had been expanding any faster, then matter would not have congealed into stars and to planets. Everything would have dissipated. It would have been like taking a handful of flour and throwing it up in the air. It's not going to congeal. Everything's going to kind of dissolve and is going to dissipate. And what would have happened in that case, matter would not have been able to clump together with sufficient gravity for stars to ignite into heat, and there would have been what they call the heat death of the universe. So matter would have been out there, but it would have been primarily the very lighter elements, mostly hydrogen and helium. It takes stars to build larger molecules. The intense heat of stars, the force of fusion and fission within the star. Stars are actually element-making factories, and sometimes when stars explode, supernovae, that's probably how we get the heavier elements, uranium, things like that. So if the forces of the expansion of the universe and the forces that are trying to make the universe contract were any different, we either would have gotten dissipation with no heat and no heavier elements, or we would have gotten condensed collapse of the universe back into kind of a steady state of incredible, the blackest of black holes. One of the scientists who was studying about the different variables about that rule the laws of physics, he conjectured that the probability of the laws of physics being set, imagine a whole set of different dials. You go into a room and there are dials that are 1 to 1,000, and you have to dial in the exact right combination of 100 different dials in order for something good to happen. The probability for all those dials to be set at the exact right value, he figured, was 1 part to 10 to the 90th power. So 10 with 90 zeros on it. That probability is actually greater than the number of elementary particles that are theorized to be in the entire universe. So the elementary particles, by the way, are particles that are smaller than atoms. In fact, they're smaller than, actually, an electron is a elementary particle, but a proton and a neutron, those are not. Remember the basic model of that you grew up with, that an atom has electrons spinning around a nucleus that has at least a proton, but often protons and neutrons. Remember that? Okay, well, back in the day, we thought these were the smallest particles. The electron is an elementary particle. It's not the only one of that type of, I think they're called muons. But protons and neutrons are actually composed of quarks, smaller pieces of matter that we call elementary particles of matter. And so if you took all of the quarks and muons and other subatomic particles in the universe, that's fewer than the chance of all those physical constants being right. So one of the fortuitous things about the universe that we live in is that there are these laws and constants of physics that only work if gravity is at a certain force, but no greater. And of course, gravity varies based on the mass. So that's why the gravity on the moon is less than gravity of Earth. But gravity is what causes the sun to go into fusion and give us heat and light. And on the other side, electromagnetism, which is a force that acts on particles, has to be fine-tuned, as well as a number of other forces that you may never have heard of. The weak and strong nuclear forces that are active in the subatomic level. The masses of those elementary particles I was just talking about have to be just so, or atoms are not possible. They won't work. So it's like taking a Lamborghini and everything for that Lamborghini to put together is a fine piece of engineering. Everything has to be just so for the thing to work. To imagine that happened just by accident, the simplest explanation is somebody designed this and someone else constructed it, because it just defies logic that this happened accidentally. The additional, last week again, we talked about the Big Bang. The same thing goes with the initial conditions of the universe. Those conditions had to be fine-tuned. The constant forces that were existing then had to be baked in. So as the universe expanded in the first few moments of the Big Bang, there would be enough ripples in the expansion of the universe that would allow for, there are actually ripples in the temperature gradient. So a couple of 100 degrees plus or minus of the ambient, incredibly intense heat of that early universe, the cool spots could congeal, and that could later turn into the stardust that out of which stars and galaxies later formed. One of the challenges of the Big Bang when we look at the universe today is, why isn't the universe just uniformly little grains of hydrogen spread out uniformly everywhere? Why isn't it like that flour that you throw up in the air and doesn't congeal at all? Why is it that there are clumps, and we call these clumps stars and planets and asteroids and galaxies and things like that? And that has to do with the preconditions of the Big Bang, that there were ripples built into them, imperfections, you might say, in the temperature, and that allowed the physical universe to congeal. There was a famous astrophysicist named Fred Hoyle in the early middle 20th century. He was actually an Australian, but he went to Cambridge, I believe, very, very famous astrophysicist and a committed atheist and skeptic, never became a Christian, but he did get to a point where he had to doubt his doubts. He was involved in something that's incredibly esoteric. He was stunned by the abundance of carbon on the planet Earth. You probably know that we're a carbon-based life form. Sugar is carbon chains. The molecules in your body are carbon-based. And even though, we kind of are an anti-carbon moment because of greenhouse gases, CO2 is carbon. Organic life is carbon-based. It's one of the reasons why when we burn oil, which is an artifact of prior life forms, organic life forms, we release carbon. We always call them dinosaur bones. They're not really dinosaur bones, but that's where oil comes from. It's carbon-based. So why is there so much carbon when at the Big Bang, most of what was created was hydrogen and helium, the lightest atoms? How did it come to be that carbon was made? Well, he knew. He didn't invent the science. He knew that it was because stars came into existence, and the stars were so intensely hot, the fusion in there allowed for atoms to fuse together to make heavier elements. The problem is, by the time you get to carbon, which is eight protons and 8 neutrons, you're getting a heavy enough atom that the road from 1 and 2, from hydrogen to helium, pretty obvious, but the amount of energy it takes to get to 8, the energy of the carbon atom should be more energetic than it actually is. And so he and a fellow scientist set about trying to figure out a way that you could bake the carbon cake in the star furnace oven. And they finally concocted a way that they thought it happened, but it took 8 distinct, unique steps that had to be just so in order for stars to form carbon atoms. And at the end of his study, still a skeptic, he said this. He said, "A common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology." Now, because, of course, he's a committed skeptic, so he's not going to say God. He says super intellect. In fact, he favored the theory that a designing intelligence maybe came from an alien galaxy or something like that, or there was somehow the early universe was seeded with precursors that affected physics and chemistry and biology. After Hoyle died, because of the improbability of the finely tuned universe, physicists started theorizing what is now the theory of the multiverse. And that is that, okay, we can't, it's impossible to believe that all these constants of physics and of star furnaces were set at the exact right dial for carbon to emerge, and not just carbon, but oxygen, all the other things that human bodies are created from, as well as the heavier elements. It's impossible for that to have happened just randomly. So maybe if we had a limitless number of universe, there would have been one fortuitous universe that in which life could have arisen, and we just happen to live in the lucky universe. The problem is that in order for all the theories of how a universe could have come to exist, they all depend on finely tuned preconditions. So it doesn't really get you out of the trap. It just creates a bigger trap. Why is this important? It's important because we're getting to the point where wise people have to learn to doubt their doubts, because sometimes the simplest explanation is that thing they really don't want to believe, and exposes people's preconceived biases. That, a person who's been a skeptic and an atheist doesn't want to embrace the idea that there might have been a designing intelligence behind the universe. You will run into people who are just decidedly convinced that there is no God and there cannot be any God. I would counsel you not to argue with that person, because their mind is made up. Perhaps there's a moment when they're persuadable, when a tragedy strikes, or when a baby is born, or when they're just reflecting upon the meaninglessness of a random universe, and the fact that they live their lives as if there is a purpose, even though they believe there is no purpose. Perhaps there's that moment, and certainly you want to pray for that moment. But beating people over the head with things, or please don't say, well, the Bible says. To someone who doesn't believe in the Bible, saying the Bible says, it just doesn't work. The Bible is only evidence for those of us who believe, not for people who don't believe. And that's why it's important that we learn to speak the language of science, as well as it gives us an insight into the beauty and the gracious fragility and wonder of the universe that God created for us to live in. I personally don't believe that God made the finely tuned universe just because it was hospitable to human life. I believe he created it because he wanted it to be beautiful as well. So when we look at Yosemite Falls, we don't just say, oh, look, H2O under the force of gravity. We see something that makes our hearts leap, because the beauty of the earth is a key that fits in the lock of our heart. And that's the same thing with music. When we hear a beautiful piece of music, we don't say, what an amazing coincidence that the sound waves that Kevin's piano is making resonates with the bones in my ear, that I'm able to discern and differentiate between the different frequencies, the vibrations that he's making. No, instead, we hear that sound and our heart thrills because it's a familiar hymn, or it's a soaring piece, Beethoven's Ninth or something like that. And there's a deep sense of resonance deep in our hearts with memories we have, with delights that we've shared, as well as the beauty of the music. It's the key that somebody designed for the lock, which is our ears and our auditory faculties, our ability to love the beauty of the world God made. And that's what we're trying to explore when we explore the created world. Anyway, have a great week. I'll be back next week when we're going to talk about the third and probably the greatest discovery of the last 100 years that really makes science the friend of those of us who believe. Have a great week. Take care. Bye.